Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the webinar series. This is the second event that we've had for the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations webinar series. And I'm really excited that we have Professor Parvati, Raghuram and Dr. Melis Cin joining us today to talk about the practicalities of decolonising peace education and to talk about the practicalities of decolonising education more broadly. And this, as you know, is a topic that's gaining more oxygen and more currency, particularly over the last year, although this is something that we've been thinking about for a very long time. But there've been growing calls over the past year, in particular, for both members of the public and politicians to decolonize education through various means, including sort of revising history curriculums and other curriculums and challenging entrenched and out-of-date national narratives. But what this means in practice and how it looks is something which is highly contested. And so today we're going to discuss that. And we have two presenters who will critically explore the challenges of decolonisation within education sectors in a variety of different contexts. So I would like to introduce both of them to you now, and I will introduce them in order. So Professor Parvati Raghuram is a professor of geography and migration at Open University in the UK. Through her numerous publications of journal articles and books and other publications, she has looked into the various ways that the mobility of individuals, goods and ideas shapes the world. She's currently principal investigator on two AHRC-funded projects, including the one that we will be discussing to some extent today, called Decolonising Peace Education in Africa. Dr. Melis Cin is a lecturer in education and social justice at Lancaster University. Dr. Cin is a feminist researcher with a particular interest in exploring the relationship between education and international development. She also investigates how education can be used as a peace-building tool. She's currently working on 4 different projects, including decolonising peace education in Africa. And she's partnering with a number of academics and practitioners who are working in Zimbabwe at the moment. And I think Melis is going to talk a little bit about some of the work that that partnership is facilitating. So thank you everybody for joining us, and I would like to hand over to Professor Raghuram to begin the presentation.
Thanks so much, thank you. And thanks so much for the invite as well as for the really generous commentary in the beginning. So I kind of named this talk Decolonising This and Decolonising That, because at the moment, wherever you go, you trip over decolonising in some forms or ways. But before I start, I'd like to build on and acknowledge my debt to those who have worked on this topic before me, those who work with me, both colonially and decolonially, for giving me different joys and challenges in this project, in the other work I do at the OU, and the ones that I do in Europe. So I'd like to just first begin by acknowledging that debt. So in the next slide, what I want to point to is that there are many forms of decolonization that are already present, as decolonization has been thoroughly colonized. It's been colonized through marketization and circulating value which has been abstracted from Black bodies through getting grants about decolonization, through opportunistic engagements about what kinds of investments in intersectionality would generate profit, and which lead you, for instance, to be able to build publications, grant profiles, and other forms of engagement, very often in places afar, without ever situating oneself in the decolonization of the present moment or thinking about what your own part in this is. right? It extracts value and it is built on that value. Most of it works through rhetorical methods, references to white scholars in the center or a few names. It operates through making, for instance, the named contributions of authors into things like as Black authors suggest. Imagine if we wrote a paper saying as white authors suggest, right? These people remain nameless. Another way in which that decolonization is operating is through postmodern sensibilities, assembling another version and putting it alongside through epistemic equivalence, sometimes relational, sometimes not relational. A third way is through concepts of inclusion, like, for instance, diversity, equality, inclusion. So you already have an existing form of knowledge, and you say, okay, we will help you to get onto our boat too. And this is particularly important in debates such around decolonization and development, with people being invited, in fact, encouraged to include themselves into an unchanging systemic presence. There's a neoliberal governance of diversity, and you see this, for instance, even when people call down Freire, for instance, and talk about mutuality and sympathy, supporting development, right? How do I help Black people into an unchanging university? Or it could be through claim making. This is a claim to rewrite a space and is about taking part in a liberatory struggle. And there are two elements to that struggle. It is global and historical, but it is also deeply situated. It is not any struggle. It is particular struggles. Most importantly, as Tuck and Yang have argued, it requires repatriation of indigenous land and life. And this is something that I will return to later. Decolonization then is not a metonym for social justice. So what is decolonizing for me? Decolonizing here and now. I want to argue that decolonization is in part about locating. What is my location? I talk about decolonizing the present, locate. What is my location? First of all, I'm an Indian, educated in India, in the UK. And long ago, I started thinking, what is the right question to ask? Why? Because I started doing my PhD. When I did my PhD, I asked my brother to take a photograph. And when he said, I'm not taking a photograph of black brown bodies for you to show on the white walls of your university, it does nothing for them. So decolonization, questions of representation, questions of what's the value of my work has been central to how I am responsible, not just for people who I interview or who I do work with, but actually my family. They were asking me, what are you doing all this? You know, why are you extracting value and circulating it in these places? What do other people get out of it? So it was core to my being. And what I realized then was that it was important to ask the right question, because my questions themselves were often coming from hypothetical deductive frameworks or from interpretive frameworks, not from questions around liberatory struggle. And ever since then, and I think the first paper that I presented around this was in 1996, asking the right question. And so when the Decolonizing Methodologies book came out by Linda Smith in 1999, it was really a boon for me because I'd been thinking about this for almost 6 or close to 10 years by then. So there were long histories of that engagement. But they always morph and mutate and change to the contemporary, to the present moment. And for me, they took on certain kinds of presences at different times. Most recently, of course, it comes through Black Lives Matter. And it is really sobering to know at my present, which is at the Open University, 35% awarding gap in first and upper seconds between Black and white students. And it's important to say here that the kinds of debates we have in our BME network steering group, and I'm a member of that, is that, okay, should Asians be part of this? Should Black people be part of it? And I always say situate, 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 okay? That's my argument, that you have to situate your argument in your place. It's not an attainment gap, it's an awarding gap. And that awarding gap is between blacks and whites. Not as much, so BAME doesn't do it. You've got to see blacks. What's my role there then, given my position? What are the institutional battles that we are engaged in to support Black students and staff? How do we support that? That's a question that I ask myself. And that's how I situate myself within decolonizing my university. I can't sit here and say, do I do decoloniality because I work in Nigeria or Zimbabwe? I don't. I do decoloniality in my institution through these forms and practices. I lead on decolonization in multiple forms within my university. I can decolonize myself and my university. I can push back at them and highlight what needs to be done. I interrogate processes such as ethical guidelines. Do they mean the same thing if we are doing a decolonial project? I interrogate things like, for instance, what happens with Southern partners, but I also need to stop myself from colonizing decolonization. These also have a second aspect to it. So site was my first concept. The second is time in this next slide. And I want to talk about three aspects of time. There's different qualities to time. There are moments of deep insights. Then there are periods when you make little headway, but through all of this, you have to have patience and stay with the trouble. Emotionally, sometimes you're excited when you go through it tough as you realize the challenges, but you have to stay with the trouble. It can be deeply frustrating, but mostly scary. It requires sweeping change of who you are and what you're set within. And practically, it means a lot of things in projects. It means a different way of managing time. You can see that what it means is changing Gantt charts. Do Gantt charts, for instance, which are so insignificant to how we organize our research, do they mean the same thing when we take them elsewhere? Do people have the same qualities of time? Those intense moments of revelation compared to those dull moments, and sometimes the very pragmatic moments as you go through things like Gantt charts. So we not only have to situate, but we also have to think about what does time mean in these different places, especially when a colleague says, well, actually, we spend a whole day sitting outside our university or registrar's office to get your ethics form through, right? It's a decolonizing project. How do we square these two different versions of time? Through all of this, you also have to learn from others. And in the next slide, you'll see about how we have learned in our project from a varieties of others, interdisciplinary others. And this is a slide from a colleague of ours, H, who's an artist. And he taught us about storytelling and arts in Africa. And he made us ask different questions. He gave us different starting points because objects are themselves interdisciplinary, right? So it always involves working and learning from others. I began by talking about situate, but situate is not enough of itself. This is really important because a lot of decoloniality is seen to be about locatedness. It isn't only that. When you talk about liberatory struggles, there is a lot more analytical work to be done too. And in the next slide, you see some of the ways in which I've worked with that. For instance, I've worked with IMISCO, which is a leading migration organization in Europe, to think about how do issues of race and colonization look in each context. Decolonization is related to, not entirely contained within colonization. So if you look at, for instance, the Dutch, when I speak to my colleagues in the Netherlands, they say, Black Lives Matter doesn't mean the same thing in the Netherlands, right? Because decolonization as a project has to take on board local realities. And there, the Islamophobia is by far and away the greatest problem that they have. In other places like Central Europe, you have some really harsh issues around the Roma population. So when we have these conversations in Europe, we have to recognize that decolonization does not look the same. it does not have the same struggles. We need to compare. And so one of the things that I'm leading on in Europe is a seminar series where we compare. So for instance, old colonials, new colonials, peripheral colonials, and we have 12 countries that we looked at, and how do questions of, say, race, racism, and anti-racism methodology and theory change and vary across each of these countries. How are they situated? What can we learn from each other? We juxtaposed these conversations because we always knew that it was never enough to just situate. We had to compare. And across the countries of our project, we do the same thing. Very early on, I was faced with a quandary of how do we do this work across 4 countries, right? So are these problematics going to look the same in Nigeria as they look in Zimbabwe? What's transferable? What can be compared? Can we actually build a peace education framework which is decolonial, or do we only offer methods for locating and for comparing? And most importantly, in the next slide, you can see that the other quandary we have is how do we collaborate? Collaboration itself requires a lot of thought in this context, particularly for me or rather differently for me as I lead on a project. We started by bringing people into the room, NGOs, partners, and the first thing I asked them is, why are you here, right? What's in decolonization for you? Because I wanted to make sure that we could try to ask the right questions, make that as locally meaningful as possible. But it was never possible to do it completely. And we're forever learning that actually perhaps we still didn't have all the people in the room to begin with. We didn't know whom we had to collaborate with. And that's a work in progress. It means being the conduit for pushing back, however. It means not doing things as much as doing things, standing aside and saying, no, I can't co-author on these things, but I can co-author on some things. Me, a white, brown academic in Europe, can't decolonize in Africa. That's not my place, right? And that's the kind of conversations of stepping back that we have to foster as part of our decolonization. And that requires also building new forms of collaboration. And in slide 11, you'll see some of those. Collaborations between African partners. And I'm really grateful to our colleague, Tommy, who reminded me actually that we needed to build South-South partnerships where there were no Northern partners, right? So they formed a decolonizing working group and they asked us questions. And they said, what is it that we need from you? How do we change the terms of our engagement with our Northern partners? It's been moderately successful, not entirely, because coloniality is everywhere, right? It's, our Southern partners too sometimes want to publish in Northern journals, high-ranked journals. There are internal forms of coloniality within universities and between universities, NGOs, and communities. So everybody occupies compromised ground. But nevertheless, we also have to keep through all of this, finding ways and routes for collaboration. But most importantly, following not Freire but Fanon, we have to recognize that decolonization meant psychological damage, not just to those in the global South, but also to the global North. So I think there's something fundamental to projects about using global South to do some reparative work in the global North, but also teaching Northern partners how to do good allyship. And I'm really grateful to my DEPA partners for that. Of course, through all of this, and in the next slide, you'll see that decolonization is deeply effective. This is not a feel-good game. As a colleague of mine tells me every time, there is no decolonization without some violence. If you decolonize, you'll be angry, upset, arguing, crying, spending sleepless nights. And I'm particularly grateful to Melis and Craig for having walked with me through some of these days and nights. If you're not, then you are not decolonizing. You're only engaging in rhetorical decolonization. It also involves from me monitoring myself, checking back in to see whether I took steps in the right direction, avoiding egocentrism and avoiding defending the self. And those are really hard when you're leading on big projects, right? But most importantly, it avoids what I need to do is to avoid lingering. Lingering is often justified on the basis that we're doing good, that we have moral authority, and that we have moral certitude. Feeling that there are universal goods, such as humanitarian causes, that can be defended. It plays to my savior attitude, or attitude of paying back for previous harms, generating new cycles of appropriation and violence. At least do no harm under the banner of decolonization. I said decolonization requires the repatriation of indigenous land and life. We all need to vacate that land so that it can indeed be repatriated. And that's the journey that decolonization involves. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Parvati. There's so much there to digest, and one of the things I think I'm definitely going to take from that is that in this journey of decolonization, we all need to have patience and stay with the trouble, and that's something I think that we've all sort of experienced over the last year or so on this project, and that's it resonates really strongly. I'm going to now introduce Melis, Dr. Melis Cin, who's going to talk about decolonising education, particularly in relation to Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much, Parvati. So Parvati has posed a really interesting questions, and I'll pick up some of those questions in my talk. So I don't have any fancy slides, but I assure that it will be an interesting talk around the issues of epistemic injustice. So before I start reflecting on my experiences of working on decolonization together with my colleagues in South Africa and Zimbabwe, I would like to highlight that I do not define myself as a researcher of decolonial theory, but I'm a student of decolonization debates, and nor did I start to engage with the decolonization over one night because it became a buzz or a popular word. I'm a feminist researcher. I've been working on the issues of gender equality, gender and peace building, gender sensitive education in Turkey, Europe, Middle East, over the 15 years, and recently in Africa over the last 5 years. So most of the issues I'll be talking today are not new to me or to my research agenda. These are the fights I have been giving as a feminist activist for many years. And the ethical principles I'll be talking today are core to my feminist research: ethics of unsettling and sexist and racist power hierarchies in society and in our institutions. So I would like to thank and give credits to all my colleagues in Africa, but in particular to Dr. Faith McMananzi and Dr. Tendai Morava from South Africa and Zimbabwe, who couldn't be with us today, but they have been key developing some of the arguments that I will be making in this talk. So as Parvati highlighted, the fundamental issue is that where decolonization should come from, and certainly not from the UK, but from and within Africa, in the countries that we're working with. But this also means that, as Parvati highlighted again, that we need to decolonize our practices and ways of doing research and collaborating. We started decolonizing peace education in Africa, which I will refer as DEPA project, with the aim of exploring different knowledges and values underpinning peace in 4 case study countries, like the initial 4 African countries: Nigeria, South Africa, Uganda, Zimbabwe, which we aim to later on roll out to other African countries. So our aim is to understand locally embedded and already existing peace strategies and values within the communities, and then insert these local values and knowledges of peace in education. You may ask the question of why education? Well, this is to do with the restorative, reconstructive, and transformative role of education in promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. And it is also important to recognize the colonial heritages in education, and aim to address this through adjusting content and pedagogical practice for improving teaching outcomes. And how do we explore these local values? Then the question is, well, arts can be a significant ally in the process of bringing out local meanings and practices around peace, as well as perceptions of the local, regional, and global interventions that enable or disable peace. Arts can account for the diversity of historical experiences and complement more conventional peace-building approaches such as mediation. For instance, exploring peace through cultural heritage practices, storytelling, intergenerational interviews, or co-creational practices of local museum spaces with local people can be one way of doing that, or can be multiple ways of doing that. Of course, we're not romanticizing the arts here, and we acknowledge that it is not automatically, using arts is not automatically conducive to peace, and can be extractive too, if not used in participatory and emancipatory ways. But once we have understood in this project the local peace values, the ways they operate in their own settings and practices, then our aim is to incorporate local knowledge and values of peace to education, and to contribute to conflict management and to overcome direct and indirect violence due to cultural, linguistic, political, or gender inequalities. So here, our aim is to work with teachers, particularly in Zimbabwe, and teacher trainees at Midland State University to be able to train next generation of teachers for peace and gender-sensitive teaching pedagogies. So again, here our aim is to decolonize learning pedagogies. And the reason why we start with teacher trainees and teacher trainers at universities is that universities are the key sites of knowledge producers, consumers, circulators. So they are the sites which need to be decolonized most. Their structures reproduce a colonial cartography of line in an effort to decolonize, or rather their approach to decolonize knowledge or systems of knowledge production. Therefore, in this talk, I want to make two important arguments in relation to decolonizing research and education that I have drawn out from this project as we work with our partners, participants, and communities in Zimbabwe and beyond. So my first argument is related to importance of, is about recentering knowledge, unsettling power hierarchies in knowledge production. As Parvati highlighted, the question of how we could decolonize our institutions, research culture remains an important one to address. But we all know that populating our reading list with the publications of Global South authors will take us nowhere unless we reorient knowledge and change the colonial governance of our universities. So in some universities, including the universities in Africa, the initial response to decolonization was to revive the Decolonizing Curriculum Initiative. And we could see a number of reading lists circulating on blogs, social media, on different disciplines, recognizing the work of Black and minority ethnic staff to reform the Eurocentric curriculum. And for some of us, this has been the call to recognize the scholarship of colleagues in the Global South and to challenge the Western idea of creating knowledge. However, we all know that adding scholarship by Global South colleagues into reading lists has very little to offer in deconstructing, challenging, or transforming a global academic system that is embedded in a gendered, racialized, and contextualized power tradition. As a feminist researcher myself, I find the decolonization project very much in spirit close to feminism. So the project of feminism actually has shown us that reading feminist theories or books by feminist authors did not necessarily erase the sexism or make our institutions more gender equal. And I think a similar position holds for any power constructs that we seek to address. So I believe in the good faith that acknowledging disparities in knowledge creation is a starting point for raising intellectual curiosity and awareness on gender stereotyping, racism, and contextual power imbalance. However, without reasoned agency by both individuals or our institutions, any attempt to change these structures will not yield a just academic or an education system. So the intellectual and honest debates on decolonization and racism are a moral and an ethical responsibility for all of us. And drawing on my experiences of engaging in multiple projects across Africa, but in particular with DEPA project, it is clear that Western knowledge traditions are still implicitly reflected and internalized in everyday research practices, from knowledge creation to establishing a research culture or protocol with colleagues across the globe. Sabelo Gatcheni and Joseph Membe actually argue that challenging colonialist approaches is not all about rejecting Western ideas, but recentering Africa, and that is the basic idea in our DEPA project and DEPA research too. What we seek is to challenge the ideas that could weave knowledge from global north as the basis of knowledge creation and overlooks indigenous or locals or simply different ways of knowing that exist across the globe. These knowledges, as we have learned and from some of our projects, are the way we researchers formulate research agendas, conduct research, and write about the research that is often much less beneficial to the participants whom we work with. So the problem may not always be the research agenda, but different development standpoints and theories may in fact be from a place of unselfish positions. So the exclusion of communities in which we conduct our research poses an indirect and perpetual reinforcement of colonial approaches to research. That is why the communities and the people we work with should be the central concern, subjects, and ethical agents of our research. And such an exclusion is actually called, as you may know, epistemic injustice. And in an effort to challenge this epistemic injustice and the colonial epistemic structures that result in unjust knowledge practices among and between academic researchers, the first step is actually to think about those colonial discourses that perpetuate uneven structures and relationships in research culture, as Parvati highlighted in her speech. So to start with the process of reflection, we ask, how can we promote a culture that embraces different positions of knowledge and complement each other's capabilities in forging an even ground without over-reliance on a single normativity that suggests a specific tradition of knowledge creation as universal? So this takes me indeed to my second argument of justice against epistemicide. So justice against epistemicide is something that we all know from the literature in the writings of the Santos. So this addressing epistemicide calls for identifying and engaging with epistemic concepts in the global south. And much of the research in the global south is driven by actually global north positions and often predefine and pre-problematize many issues in global south without critical contextual engagement. And this leads to a deficit model of attempting to address a problem that may not be a problem at all. Rather, our position should rather be adopting an inclusive approach and searching for epistemologies of the south. And this knowledge can be from fellow researchers, from the communities in which we work. For example, in our recent arts project with an indigenous community in Zimbabwe, we found that although the participants enjoyed learning about and being exposed to new art methods of graffiti, which is also known as street art, as a way of political art, to express their concerns regarding being a youth or the intercommunal conflict they're exposed to, they expressed that they equally value the use of traditional ways of storytelling, such as folk tales. And this was evident in their articulation of their stories, manifestos of their graffitis in Tonga language and Tonga poetry, but also drawing and painting cultural heritage objects that are unique to Tonga community and community museum. So when we restarted working with Tonga community in Zimbabwe, again, as a part of the DEPA project, one of the first things we asked communities and the youth was to collectively decide on the creative arts and the cultural heritage tools they would like to use in expressing everyday peace and conflict they're experiencing. Then we just asked them to, collaboratively and collectively unearth the values the values that they want to be taught to the next generations, and the values that they want to be embedded into teacher training.
So this is an example that there is an alternative to Western episteme and to explore, to explain and theorize different ways of knowing and realities of everyone. So identifying Southern informed episteme also requires rethinking our research method and methodologies and recognizing the knowledge that exists in the global South and learning from it. So the process of learning from each other provides a profound knowledge exchange for global South and global North researchers. If we look into the amount of papers or the amount of the work that produced, we can say that a significant number of academics in global South draw on the work of global North, but how the Northern academics follow, read, and contribute to academic debates and knowledge created by colleagues in the South is something that is not very much evident. So the researchers in the North understand the challenges and the conditions of knowledge creation in the context they conduct research in the South. Maybe perhaps it is a time to answer this question and time to exercise a moral responsibility of promoting equal epistemic opportunities for those situated on the other side of epistemic line and learn from each other. But of course, doing this involves crediting each other's contribution and upholding accountability of the intellectual property rights of co-produced knowledge and scholarship. And it also involves crediting the communities that we work with and co-writing with the communities that we co-produce. So recognizing and crediting this kind of scholarship should not be a way of making another's work seem as though it matters, but it should be about deeply engaging with the work, genuinely marking, genuinely drawing lessons that can be learned, and respectfully challenging any positions of difference. Otherwise, this again poses questions about how we critically think about the politics of knowledge production. So I acknowledge that the decolonization project needs a holistic approach of deconstructing the power relationship between race, gender, masculinities, and more so for research like ours, DEPA, whose purpose is entangled in the agendas of many stakeholders, funders, fund administrators, higher education institutions, communities, and the researchers themselves. So we need to start to have those uncomfortable conversations, like Parvati said, amongst each other on what makes inclusive and respectful systems in research and knowledge production. And in this project, we're constantly aiming to challenge the historical placement of Western epistemic tradition that claims to offer a universal way of generating knowledge. And we ask the question of whether Southern researchers and communities are subjected to a colonial epistemic governance system. And this is the complexity of the decolonizing research agenda. It is multi-level, it is multidimensional, and requires more than just building alliance, but also a conscience of what a justice for all research and knowledge system would look like. And this again requires reflecting on our epistemic and political responsibilities as the UK-based researchers when working with the communities and the researchers of the South. And that was some of the ideas that I tried to tap onto, and I think from now on will be Stephen accepting questions. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Melis. There is so much there that I think I'm going to spend the next few days trying to digest, because it's just so rich with ideas and critical reflections around the process of decolonization and how even just beginning to understand how colonial discourses perpetuate epistemic injustices in various ways at various levels through various subtle and sometimes obvious power relationships and differences. To actually get to the heart of this is uncomfortable, as you say, and as Parvati says, it involves staying with the trouble. There's so much to unpack, and we can't do that in an abstract and detached way, because we're all kind of interwoven into those power relations and those layers of relationships. So it's uncomfortable, and it's never entirely linear or clear. So yes, we need a holistic approach to decolonizing education. We need to be very aware of our own positions and our own positionalities, and we need to constantly revise, reflect, and reconsider where we are and how we relate with others, and where and whose knowledge systems are we blind to, and what do we lose from that, and vice versa. So I won't speak anymore, because I'd like to open it up to any questions, thoughts, statements that anybody would like to make. I would welcome. So the first question is from Imran Arif.
The process that you describe, Melis, in trying to gain value and identify where the value sits within those communities, from those communities, and for the Northern researchers within their paradigm to engage with that and really try and understand that in that way. Also, when you think about it within the project of decoloniality, it perhaps also requires the Northern people to let go of some of their systems and structures. And so my question is, like, can you give me some examples of that? How would you see that happening? How can you force that from happening from within? Because that's important to me to know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Imran, for this. Actually, you made a very good point that, as the, the global North-based researchers, I want to say the global North-based researcher, because global, being based in global North does not necessarily make you a global North researcher. So you might, we have so many, we have probably Parvati and I had this double consciousness of, being from global South, but also being based in global North. So trying to navigate those spaces and trying to, and never being able to position ourselves actually somewhere. So actually, I very much agree that sometimes, and that this was one of the conversations that we had with Parvati when we were talking about the traditions and the philosophy of African, the African philosophy and the traditions and the cultural heritage issues that rest with these communities. And one of the things that we exactly said that, as global North researchers, maybe, it is not our responsibility. It's that maybe we shouldn't be part of all debates, no? Maybe we shouldn't really, if we're not understanding some of those values, and we shouldn't, not everything should be accessible to us. So some debates should be really particular to, should be really less rest with Africa, and should be really, be the debates or discussion points of the African researchers. And in this project, actually, if you ask how we do that, along with this project, we have a decolonizing a group, which is run by our African partners. And in this group, it's only a space for our African researchers, that we, as the global North-based researchers, are not going into any of these debates. It's a closed group among themselves, and this is one way of keeping yourself away from those values and those debates. And I definitely agree that we don't have to be part of everything, and this could be reflected in a way that you don't have to be part of every paper that comes from that project, or you don't have to be the discussion point, or you don't have to lead every discussion that is happening in that particular project. And some of those values and ideas or debates should not necessarily be published in Western journals, but within the Africa, within the South African or African, or any kind of African journals, or those kind of work and value extracted from this kind of work should not maybe published with the Western publishing houses, but there are very nice open access publishing companies in Africa that could host these kind of work. So these are some practical examples of how we can. How we are trying to do it particularly in this project.
Yeah, I think there's one of the things that worries me is overall is that, of course, our African partners also want to be published in Northern journals. There's a value added to that. There are not necessarily, there's a very particular way of speaking into some of these journals. And sometimes we, with practice, can do that. We can, or even writing a grant application. Can I honestly say that all the African partners took part in it? No. They were given sections to write on their own countries, but we pulled it together from here because we knew the system and we knew what we had to fit into. Now, so right from the start, who funds the project, right? The fact that what's that word with due diligence? Yeah, that we, we ask those organizations to do due diligence, but then they didn't do due diligence to us, but actually they should have, because actually our GCRF funds disappeared, right? So this is the fundamental ground on which we walked, but itself hugely problematic. So navigating that is very complicated, because, for instance, I say, yeah, we need to upload the data into an open data source. So yesterday I spent some time looking at different types of open data sources. And I'm conscious that it's easy to do that in my university or through the reshare or something like that. Does Nigeria have an open database or repository? No, they didn't necessarily have one, right? UNISA had one. UNISA is one of our partners, but it goes into the library and it's not necessarily easily findable. So it's so structurally unequal that actually any decolonization process absolutely struggles to achieve its decolonial aims, right? It always has to deal with the complete coloniality of the present while finding practicality. So all the time we are, similarly in another project, we do something called, which is on enabling African scholars to write into Western journals. So slow steps of, okay, make sure the introduction is like this, make sure that this is like this. Then we work with journals to actually open up the back end of their process and to show the pages that the reviewers and the managers, editors see, which even we don't usually see, so that they could familiarize themselves, African scholars could familiarize themselves with this. This is not decolonial. This is coming out of a process of inclusion into the same global north processes, right? So another friend of mine who's deeply skeptical about many of my projects said to me, well, I wouldn't do something like that because frankly, I want the Western academic journals to change what they do first. They need to think differently. And am I challenging them? So sometimes I do. I'm trying to build, for instance, conference policies and all sorts of, there are multiple things that I work on trying to change the global north. But at the same time, I also do the work of inclusion. And I know that that's because one is what people want, but another side is to change what is, the current structures. And is it colonial of me to enable inclusivity? Possibly, but it's what people want. So there's colonialities everywhere. So this is the question that we have to always think about, There's no easy ground when actually all rewards are set within a colonial system.
I just wanted to add something to what Parvati said, and that speaks partly to Imran's question as well. The value of seeing, those values that we get from the communities and so on. I think, yes, we do not, as the researchers sitting in the global north, we may not have the right to know all those values, but what I find valuable about those values is that it is a way of changing this colonial way of structure of, that the knowledge goes from global north to global south. So I want to learn from those values and, use those values in the global north. I want to use those values in my own teaching as I train and my students, or as I talk about peace concepts. So I want these, these kind of hierarchical relationships that the Eurocentric norms are being produced here in the UK or in Europe and are being transferred to the global south to see how it works in practice. Maybe it is time to do vice versa. And that's why I think these values are really important in terms of, transferring it to our own context. So this is one of the things that I find extremely valuable about this project, what I can learn from those values and how those values can sort of manifest itself in my own teaching and context.
Bahar is wondering, where should we start with decolonizing our teaching and syllabi? How can we go beyond putting token Global South academics in our syllabus, but actually walk the talk in our classrooms?
Well, I think I partially, responded that when I say that it is about mostly challenging the sexist and racist stereotypes, attitudes, implicit and explicit discrimination in our institutions. This is like how it starts with being very much being sensitive to these kind of racial and gender dynamics, and it's also about our universities as well, changing our institutions, as Parvati said. How do we challenge the due diligence process or the ethical process, where the UK institution says, oh, this doesn't align with our ethical guidelines, but research is being done in Africa, so we don't really care whether it aligns with your ethical guidelines, that as long as it aligns with the safeguarding principles, like in the global south. Maybe this is just like the conversations that we should be having. How can you have a research based in Africa and then expect it to be aligned with the guidelines and the safeguarding principles produced in another context? So these are the maybe small issues that we should start to challenge in our institutions to decolonize the way that we teach, the way that we research, and the way that we practice our everyday academic lives.
In my university, as leading the Decolonizing the University initiative, some of the things that we're doing is it depends on the scale of some of this. So in the at the university level, the race equality charter marks are a really strong, they really have a lot of weight. And so the kinds of questions they ask us, what's the community? What membership, if your community consists of so many Black people, why aren't they in then your university to begin with, right? How are you engaging with people outside of the university? What's the besiding and assiding of the university that you're doing? How does the university do good assiding work? So what kinds of outreach, what kinds of open days, and what kinds of recruitment practices, all those questions. So those are questions of membership and voice. So look around the room. Is the membership right? Are people in the right roles and responsibilities? Explicitly invite voices to speak to particular issues. So if you don't have, for instance, teachers who are Black teachers, you need to ask yourself what's lost, right? Then there are really practical ways of doing allyship in relatively white institutions, which involves refusing to, the standard practices are denial, omission, decontextualization, taking a colorblind approach, dumping, patronizing, avoidance, and retention of power. So those involve refusal to accept racism exists, ignoring racial dimensions through omission, decontextualization is accepting racism exists and out there but not in here, taking a colorblind approach like treating minority ethnic people as if they were the same everywhere, dumping, placing the responsibility for creating but also addressing racism on Black people, patronizing, deeming that the majority ethnic groups' ways are superior, and retaining power in a room. Then there are a whole set of questions around leadership. Then there's questions about communication. How do you communicate your teaching? Some of the things that we're doing in this project is looking at learning design and how do we actually design a curriculum so that it's the right mix of things like, for instance, between interpretive and assessment and assimilative. So assimilative knowledges is often textual, but perhaps you need more of interpretive knowledges. Maybe you need more experiential knowledges if you're working with Black students in your neighborhood in a very white context, right? How do you bring on that experiential? What's the mix? And do you evaluate for those things? What forms of evaluation? So in the South African case, one of the things they're looking at in multilingual societies, how far do we use not just different languages, but also sound in new ways for evaluation. And then, of course, there are questions of content, right? And very practical things like what is the right categorical explanation, making the familiar strange, making the strange familiar approach. So there's a whole, so citations is only very part, and then there's lots of stuff around delivery that we look at, which is on and not just on learning design for delivery, but also digital delivery and what does it mean in a digital classroom, both for peer-to-peer work as well as to do for for teachers and teaching. And for mediated and distributed forms of teaching, where you may be the module leader, but then you might have a teaching assistant. And then what does that involve? So those are all some of the questions that we are looking at, and then a complaint system. If this doesn't work, safe space reporting. So this is some of the range of activities that I'm involved in at the Open University.
So there's a question from Amjad. We often refer, and rightly so, around decolonisation in relation to Africa, but I'm curious if there is a spectrum of decolonisation processes as we consider, for example, how we engage with Asia, the Pacific, the Middle East, Latin America, or the Caribbean, in which case, are there some similarities and differences in approaching these conversations?
Yes, so definitely there are a lot of differences, both nationally and internationally, both in terms of the questions that people ask as well as the receptions they get. So if you look at the First Nations people in Canada, their questions are different, but are similar to those around questions of land and ownership as the Aboriginals in Australia, and sometimes the same as those around questions of land, for instance, that Johnson, who's here in this room, is looking at in the context of Northern Ghana and acephalous societies, a term which I didn't know that existed till Johnson told me a week ago. Now, look, I use it happily. So these are the kinds of, so there are similarities, say, for instance, around questions of land. Similarly, indigenous people in Latin America. But on the other hand, the language around epistemology and epistemic claims is again very different in different places. So where is good collaboration? So I think some of the really interesting work around this and the challenges are going to be around collaboration. So to stop it from being individualized, localized questions, which is really crucial, but to think about how do you then bring together. Sometimes the bringing together is relatively easy because, for instance, in the South African case, we talked about decolonization in the university sector, and the fees must fall, right? But that fees must fall was a national claim, right? Because a higher education itself is set within national boundaries. But of course, the nation itself is a colonial inheritance. It's bisects and subsects communities and systems. So how do you include, say, international students into that national student struggle, for free? Is education bordered and boundaried through fees and not just through epistemic claims? So those are the questions that one might ask in order to do these forms of collaboration. That is collaborating through shared concerns over distant places, but also recognizing that actually the distance may actually be very little because you had shared forms of colonial inheritances and exploitation, irrespective of location.
Thank you so much, Parvati and Melis. I think we will wrap things up now. We've gone a few minutes over time, but I didn't want to stop because it's so interesting. And the more we talk about this, and we talk about decolonization every week, it makes me more uncomfortable and more enriched every time we have these conversations, and that's a really important thing. I really appreciate the richness of both of your presentations. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you all. Thanks so much, and thanks very much for the invite.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.